Welcome to St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. This is the 10th Sunday after Pentecost, and the topic for this morning's sermon is a portion of the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. And here's the setting for this Gospel passage. King Herod had just beheaded John the Baptist. Jesus and the disciples were worried that the authorities would be soon coming after them. So Jesus went off by himself to pray, but the disciples and crowds soon followed him. They ended up at a deserted place with no food. The disciples encouraged Jesus to send away all those people to find something to eat. But Jesus told the disciples to feed the thousands of people themselves with the little bit of bread and a little bit of fish they had on hand. And you know the rest of that story. We heard it last week. From that small amount of food, there was plenty for all, with bushel baskets left over. Immediately after that, Jesus sent the disciples away from him in a boat, and while he went off by himself to pray. Jesus, in every case like that, sets an example for us. When faced with a crisis or when setting a new direction for himself, he goes off by himself to pray. And while the disciples were out in that little boat, while Jesus was alone on the shore, the disciples were out far away from shore in the middle of the night. The wind began to blow, and the little boat became battered by waves. Now, before I go on with the story, I want to note that the disciples were not terrified at this point in the story. The story says just that their boat was battered by waves and that the wind was against them. They were bouncing around a lot, and they were having difficulty making any headway against the wind, but apparently they were not yet afraid. Now, this passage brings to mind another boat story earlier in the Gospel of Matthew, on chapter 8, if you want to look it up. In that story, Jesus also found himself surrounded by crowds, so he gave orders to go to the other side of the lake, and he got into a boat with the disciples. Again, in that earlier story, a windstorm arose out on the sea, so that the little boat was being swamped by the waves. But oddly, Jesus was asleep through the storm, and the disciples were terrified at this point, so they woke Jesus up and cried out, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." Jesus rebuked the disciples, saying to them, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" Then he rebuked the storm, and suddenly there was calm. The disciples were left wondering, who is this man, and what sort of man is he that the winds and waves obey him? Now, there are some intriguing parallels between these two boat stories, and there must be a reason that Matthew, and only Matthew of all the four Gospels, tells both stories in his Gospel passage. In both cases, Jesus is trying to get away from the crowds. In the first, Jesus sends the crowds away so that he can be alone to pray, but then he gets into a boat and the disciples follow him. In the second, Jesus sends the disciples across the sea so that he can be alone to pray. And then in the first story, the disciples are terrified of the storm, but in the second, they seem to be handling the stormy weather, although it impedes their progress across the sea. In the second story, the disciples become terrified when they see Jesus walking across the sea toward them in the storm, because they don't recognize him and they think he's a ghost. But in both stories, Jesus rebukes the disciples for their lack of faith. In the first case, he rebukes all the disciples because they are afraid, but in the second story, he rebukes only Peter. And in both cases, his rebuke is in response to the cry, "Lord, save me." And finally, at the end of the first story, the disciples are wondering, who is this guy? But at the end of the second story, they seem to have discovered the answer to that question as they proclaim, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now, there's quite a lot of supernatural element in both of these stories, so I imagine the gospel writer assumes that we, the readers, know that he is speaking in a metaphor. So the only thing is, we need to understand what the metaphorical elements in the stories are and what they meant to the gospel writer as they meant and what they mean to his audience. So sea, as a metaphorical element, figures often in the Bible as a source of chaos. In the beginning of creation, the waters were part of the chaotic void out of which God created everything. Psalm 89 proclaims of the Lord, "You rule over the surging sea. When its waves mount up, you still them." And we sing about that in the familiar hymn, "Almighty Father, strong to save, whose arm hath bound the restless wave, who bids the mighty oceans deep its own appointed limits keep." The sea indicates chaos. God brings order. The other metaphorical element in these stories is the boat. In the first centuries, the church was often portrayed as a small vessel on the sea. Church buildings are still built with a nautical theme to remind us that the church is like a ship and that we are all on board together, pulling the oars with Christ as our captain. The worship space is called a nave, precisely because of that symbolic imagery of the church as a boat. Most scholars believe that the audience of Matthew's gospel was the early church community. And this early church community was struggling with oppression from outside of the church community, as well as struggling with contentious arguments, splitting the community apart from within. So it's easy to imagine the early church as a small vessel struggling to navigate on dangerous waters. It's also easy to view the church today as a small vessel struggling to navigate in dangerous waters. So in our gospel story today, the disciples have been alone with the threatening waves for hours. It is the middle of the night. In this realm of evil and chaos, it is not surprising that they first mistook Jesus as he walked across the water in the waves as a specter of death. Over the disciples' cries of fear, Jesus calls out to them across the waves, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." A more literal translation of those words from Greek might be, "Take heart, I am." So Jesus reveals himself to them not as their teacher and friend, but as the great I am. This is the name that God revealed to Moses at the burning bush. In the midst of chaos, Jesus reveals himself as God as we struggle to persevere in the midst of a pandemic while confronting racial injustice and huge divisions in our world today. Confronted by this inexplicable reality that their friend and teacher is the God who controls the forces of chaos, Peter does an inexplicable thing. He asks Jesus to command him to walk across the water. Now, why would Peter ask Jesus to command him to step out of the boat? When I preached on this same passage years ago, I wrestled with this question and I came up with a conclusion that we should just stay in the boat. Usually when we hear sermons about this story, the preacher will say that we need to step out of our comfort zones like Peter did. Peter got out of the boat to be like Jesus. He started to sink because his faith faltered. So we should keep our eyes on Jesus, look steadfastly on him. Don't let doubt and fear come into our hearts and trouble us. But Jesus will save us only if we have enough faith. But the thing is, in that tiny boat surrounded by waves and storm, there's no safe comfort zone. Peter, by stepping out of the boat, is abandoning his friends who are still in the boat, struggling with waves. Neither the disciples nor in the boat nor Jesus cheer Peter on when he steps out of his boat for his courage. Instead, Jesus rebukes Peter for being afraid. And when Peter asks Jesus to command him to step out of the boat, he says to Jesus, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you." So why would Peter think he can walk on water? What would that prove anyway? How is walking on water going to help him believe that it's really Jesus? Maybe Peter believes that by stepping out on the sea, he will show the act of courage he needs for faith. Maybe Peter imagines that he will be convinced of Jesus' promises if he thinks big. Maybe Peter will believe in himself if he's able to do what Jesus does. Maybe Peter's asking something like, how can we really trust that you are with us and that you will be with us forever? And maybe Jesus is answering, well, it's certainly not because you're able to walk on water if that's what you're thinking. So Peter steps out of the boat, notices the strong wind, and begins to sink. Immediately Peter cries out, Lord, save me! And that's when Jesus rebukes him. But first, Jesus reaches out his hand and pulls Peter up out of the water. And then Jesus says to Peter and to us, you of little faith, why do you doubt? Now, I've seen paintings of this scene, and some show Peter slowly sinking into the waves about waist deep. But don't you really think that if Peter suddenly began to sink, he would just plop into the water like a stone and not slowly drift down to the waves while he has this conversation with Jesus? But instead, Jesus' reaction to Peter was instantaneous and automatic. Jesus immediately grabs Peter's hand and pulls him to safety, saying, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And this rebuke comes in response to the cry, Lord, save me. Is Jesus rebuking us for doubting that he will in fact save us? Is he rebuking us for not seeing him for who he really is? Is he rebuking us for putting ourselves in needless peril? In any case, Jesus is demonstrating that whether we stay in the boat, in this little community of faith, surrounded by the surging seas, or if we put ourselves in peril outside of this community of faith, he will still reach out his hand instantly and bring us to safety. There's an old hymn that begins, Jesus calls us o'er the tumult of life's wild and restless sea. In today's gospel reading, Jesus indeed calls his disciples in the midst of the wild and restless sea, but in this story, he calls them into the tumult. So perhaps a lesson from this gospel is that Jesus does indeed send us out into the tumultuous and chaotic world. But Jesus sends us out together in our community of faith. And for us, our community of faith includes those gathered in the parking lot for worship on Sunday mornings, as well as our brothers and sisters at home and online. And perhaps we're not supposed to get out of the boat. Perhaps we are not supposed to step out of our faith community. In any case, when we are in trouble, whether we're in the boat or out of the boat, Jesus does not want us to doubt his hand is instantly there to help us and offer us comfort and safety. The story is meant to reveal to us who Jesus is. But that revelation may only be possible in the midst of chaos. If Jesus had not sent his disciples out into this tumultuous and chaotic journey, they would have missed the opportunity to see that God was revealed to them in their very midst. God is always present in the chaos and in the tumult, lifting us up and encouraging us to take heart, to not be afraid, to take hold of the hand God is always offering to us, and to be prepared to serve as Jesus did, as agents of peace in a tumultuous world. Thanks be to God.